So good evening, everyone. My name is Nikki Freeman. I am the Director of Education at the Holocaust Memorial Miami Beach, and it is my pleasure to introduce tonight Sidney Portnoy, who just spoke, and he's the chair of the Holocaust Memorial. So Sidney.
Thanks, Nikki. So on behalf of the Miami Beach, at Holocaust Memorial Miami Beach and the Zachor Society, I am pleased to welcome you to the second part of our series, Exploring Contemporary Anti-Semitism. This evening, we will explore with Ira Forman and hopefully Dr. Michael Berenbaum, the anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism, and how even legitimate criticism of Israel's government can become the fuel for Jew hatred. As we listen in on this important conversation, we do so with the knowledge that there is much misrepresentation of Israel out there by so many, and those misrepresentations are leading to attacks on Jews everywhere. I want to extend a special welcome to members of the Holocaust Memorial Miami Beach Zachor Society, whose support provides funding on an annual basis that ensure the continuity of the educational programs and initiatives at the Holocaust Memorial and its work throughout the community. Please welcome Ira Forman, visiting professor of contemporary anti-Semitism at Georgetown University and senior fellow at Georgetown University Center for Jewish Civilization, and hopefully along with Dr. Michael Berenbaum. Here's Michael, right on cue. Thank you, Michael.
I have to begin by apologizing to our hosts because I've given them a little bit of hesitancy. I got on at 7:33 because I'm speaking to you from Dallas, Texas, with the 53rd annual Scholars Conference on the Holocaust. And one of the issues we're engaging in is the issue of anti-Semitism. Let me introduce we're continuing today what we began last week, which was an overview of contemporary anti-Semitism. And we have a very special guest, Ira Forman, who's been formally introduced to you. Ira Forman also, previously in his career, first of all, he's written brilliantly about American politics and the Jews. But for our purposes, one of the most important things that he's done is to serve as the head of the State Department's Office on Anti-Semitism, which is the position that Deborah Lipstadt is now seeking confirmation for. She's been nominated by the president and the like. So Ira brings to us a vast overview of the world and the issue of anti-Semitism, heightened in the past 5 years since Ira has left the job. And there's almost no one in the world that I would rather be engaged in dialogue with on the issue of anti-Semitism and also the issues surrounding anti-Semitism and Israel than Ira Forman. Since he's just returned from Europe, we will also talk very briefly about what's on everybody's mind today, which is what is happening in the world. But let's first begin with anti-Semitism because we should stick to our topic. There may be others who will want to engage first in the Ukraine, and the information on the Ukraine changes virtually hour by hour. So first of all, welcome, Ira. And
thank you.
As for giving everybody a little bit of hesitancy, but getting on Zoom in foreign quarters is not always easy. So Ira, tell us a little bit about how you're perceiving the world today. And let me also say that with all the elements of anti-Semitism in Israel, we should note something quite remarkable, which is, and think of this historically for a moment, which is yesterday on Shabbat, the Prime Minister of Israel, a religious Jew who ordinarily does not travel on Shabbat, met with Mr. Putin, spoke to Mr. Zelensky, and then went to Berlin to debrief on his meeting with Putin, if that's not a milestone in Jewish history, I don't know what is, but it's an important moment for us to recognize. So Ira, why don't you begin? Tell us a little bit about how you're seeing things at this moment.
Well, thank you, Michael. I'm certainly glad that we're now in a dialogue rather than a monologue. It'll make for a much better program. So, you know, I love that you began with history, because the only way I think I can approach this topic of anti-Semitism, and particularly the anti-Semitism which we call the new anti-Semitism, which is associated with Israel, is to try to take an historical overview of it. If you look at the long span of Jewish history since the destruction of the Second Temple, there's a pattern of what anti-Semitism looks like. And the pattern is this, I think, even though anti-Semitism can be very diverse from different quarters, different supposedly reasons, there's a tendency in societies that if there is a revered concept or institution that is one of the higher values of the society, anti-Semitism manifests itself as the attack by Jews against that institution or that concept. So through much of this past 2,000 years, that concept was the church, and certainly in Europe. And the church was a revered institution, and Jews were the people who not only killed Jesus Christ, but also were attacking the church and were in a conspiracy to undermine the church and church values. When we get to the 19th century, and we've been through the Enlightenment, and people start, a lot of people are less attached to religion. One of the new religions is science, that we can understand the world through science. And out of that comes this pseudoscience of racial theory, where suddenly Jews are no longer just a religious or ethnic group, they're a race. And their toxicity, their willingness to undermine society is not based on some ideas that are in their religion, it's in their blood. And so we have eugenics, which is, by the way, of course, not just as in Nazi Germany, but perhaps in some ways even starting stronger in the United States, where we have studies of people's craniums, the studies of people's looks to have this pseudoscience of race. The Nazis adopt this, and Jews are a race that need to be eliminated. In the post-World War II era, after the horror of the Holocaust, it became more difficult for people to talk disparagingly directly about Jews. Not that it didn't happen, but it was more difficult. Certainly, racial theories were frowned upon, even if people believed it. You didn't say it in many Western societies among polite company. So what you have is this morphing of a new form of anti-Semitism, which certainly after the Six-Day War and after the Yom Kippur War begins to grow and grow and grow, where essentially the new Jew is the state of Israel. And if you hear some of the rhetoric associated around Israel, not all the rhetoric, but we'll talk about that a little bit too, that you have to distinguish, but oftentimes you can hear a rant that sounds like a classic anti-Semitic rant, but instead of saying the word Jew, you say the word Israel. And that somehow gives you some kind of protection.
Or you say the Z word.
Yes, or you say the Z word. Yes, Israel, which are in some ways, Israel and Zionism become a one type of great enemy that's conspiring against the world. Essentially, and of course, the irony of this is that suddenly Israel is the new Nazi among nations. Not only just irony, but the viciousness of it in the wake of the Holocaust to call Israel the new Nazism. But let's also remember that the other forms of anti-Semitism, church forms of anti-Semitism, and of course, through medieval times in the Muslim world, though anti-Semitism was not as prevalent as in Christendom, the revered institution concept was Muhammad, the prophet, and the Jews had difficult times in the Muslim world. It was often because they were the enemies, supposedly, of the prophet. But we have in the other types still existing. So, for example, if you go to Eastern Europe, where I've spent a fair amount of time, it is not Israel by and large. There's some instances, but by and large, the anti-Semitism is the classic neo-Nazi, right-wing nationalist anti-Semitism. And of course, if we go to places like France or the United States, we have multiple forms of anti-Semitism. We have anti-Semitism that's coming out of certain smaller parts of the Muslim community that in some cases turn violent. We have the anti-Semitism of the radical left. We have the anti-Semitism of the neo-Nazi right and other forms. The people who attacked the Black Israelites who attacked Jews in Jersey City, they don't fit under any of these categories. But again, it's always Jews in a conspiracy theory mode.
Ira, let me ask you, we have a holdover question from last week.
Yes.
One of our participants, Alan, has asked, should we stop using the word anti-Semitism and just do something much basic, the phrase Jew hatred, which he considers more powerful and more truthful, as it were?
Well, I'll address that from a perspective of practicality more than what theoretically, why one can say that anti-Semitism can be confusing. People often think of Semites as a people or a race or something, and Semitism, there is no such thing as Semitism. There's Semitic languages. And so, one of the prime late 19th century anti-Semites coined the word specifically to talk about Jews, not about other people who might have a Semitic language like Arabs, etc. There are lots of people who have talked about using a different type of formula. One of the people I think speaks most eloquently about what anti-Semitism is all about, David Nuremberg of the University of Chicago, used the term anti-Judaism. But I think from a practical point of view, this is the word that is understood throughout the world. And there's a lot of things to do to combat anti-Semitism. And frankly, I don't think that spending the time on changing the terminology will have nearly the impact of many other things that we could do. Michael, you want me to talk a little bit about the IRA definition and some examples?
Let's talk about the issue first. Let me ask 3 questions, answer them in whatever order you want.
Okay. Well, since my memory's not so good, I'm going to take some notes here, Michael.
Okay. First question is, how do we distinguish between legitimate criticism of the state of Israel and anti-Semitism?
Great question.
The second question is, has there been any change in the way in which international organizations pile on to Israel and sort of victimize Israel? And is that going to change at all with the Abraham Accords? And are we going to begin to notice that? And
so is the Abraham Accords the third question?
And the third question is not Abraham Accords. The third question is, how dangerous was Prime Minister Bennett's attempt to mediate? But let's go to the first 2 questions first.
Yeah. Okay. So the first one, distinguishing between legitimate criticism of Israel and true anti-Semitism. Well,
let's first tell some in our audience. Israel is a human entity, which means by its very nature, it's imperfect. There is no state that has yet reached the level of perfection, and no policy that does not warrant criticism by somebody that is trying either to improve it, change it, transform it, reject it, etc. So I don't think we should feel uncomfortable with what I call legitimate criticism of Israel. In the same way we have legitimate criticism of the United States, legitimate criticism of France, of any other human entity, imperfect as we all are.
Yes, well, we agree. We agree, Michael. The one definition of anti-Semitism, which is used by many of the people or professionals in this field who are combating anti-Semitism, is the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And it's not anything that's particularly brilliant, but it's very useful on a practical level. And it is often reviled by people who say it is an attack on First Amendment rights. It tries to stifle Palestinian, legitimate Palestinian speech, etc. And yet the IRA definition itself says very specifically, and I'm paraphrasing now, criticism of Israel is not inherently anti-Semitic. That Israel needs to be treated exactly as other nations, as you mentioned, like the United States or the UK or Russia, etc. It is legitimate to criticize Israel, but there are lines that are crossed. Now, sometimes the lines are not 100% clear, and that's an important issue that we need to, I think, discuss tonight. But if any attempt to try and say that all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic essentially ties our hands in the fight against anti-Semitism. Because Israel, again, should be treated exactly like any other nation, no better, no worse. What the situation is that often in the international arena and often in certain other aspects of society, we see it in academia today, Israel is not treated the same. It's not treated better, by and large, it's treated much worse. And so how do you distinguish that? There's no perfect way, and there is some subjective judgment always. But Natan Sharansky came up with a formula called the 3 Ds. When you delegitimize Israel, when you demonize Israel, or you treat Israel with a double standards. According to the IRA definition, when you do any one of those three, it may be, depending on context, anti-Semitic. Now, the opponents of the IRA definition, and people say that this criticism of Israel is bunk and all it is an attempt to defend Israel, say, well, that formulation, these 3 Ds, is essentially stifles all criticism of Israel. And this is simply ridiculous, partly because they ignore the fact that the IRA definition says that criticism of Israel is not inherently anti-Semitic, and it ignores this caveat, which is it may be anti-Semitic depending on context. So context is always important. When people say, let's use an example, I think Michael's most helpful, I see it all the time, that Israel is committing genocide. Israel is committing ethnic cleansing. I don't know what people's intentions are in saying that, but it almost inevitably, when you say that, you've crossed the line. There is nothing that, any criticism you can have against Israel, and there's many, many that I personally have, like I have against various governments, including my own country, it does not lead to a definition of genocide by any stretch of the imagination. You move one step down, you say ethnic cleansing. Well, again, there's definitions of what ethnic cleansing is. And if Israel is responsible for ethnic cleansing, then Israel is the worst perpetrator in history of ethnic cleansing, because the Palestinian populations of the West Bank and Israel itself have exploded since 1948. I think at least tripled in the West Bank and Gaza, and grown significantly within Israel itself. So if there's ethnic cleansing, essentially it's not.
They're not very good at it.
Yeah, they're not very good at it. They're not only not very good, really, really bad at it. But yet you have a group of people, I'm just not going to pick on them alone, but I have some examples of Jewish Voice for Peace. The Barnard chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace, which I assume is undergraduates, people that are 18 to 22, bright people. Certainly, if you got into Columbia Barnard, you are doing well in the academic world. And if people are saying genocide and ethnic cleansing, well, maybe they're uninformed. But when you use terms like that, terms that are very, very serious charges of human rights abuse, some of the most serious, and that bring up essentially the sense of Nazism, you have a responsibility to have some at least basic understanding of if what you're saying is a total lie. You can't get away with, I was told this is true. This is outrageous, and people should be, listen, they have free speech. They can say any nonsense they want, but they also need to be expected to have some very deep criticism for the nonsense they say. Another example, I'm at Georgetown, and of course I see the student environment, but Georgetown's a relatively conservative campus. And I've spoken, for example, at George Washington University, where there's much of this, what we would call anti-Israel sentiment. And we had a panel on anti-Semitism a few years back, and a young man from, again, Students for Justice in Palestine, it wasn't Jewish Voice for Peace, actually, got up at the Q&A session and said, well, Mr. Forman, what do you have to say about the fact that 200,000 Ethiopian Jews have been sterilized by the state of Israel? And I, of course, was taken aback, and I said, well, I know nothing of this. I'll certainly be happy to research it. But can I ask you, sir, how many Ethiopian Jews are there in the state of Israel? And he said, well, I actually don't know. I said, well, there are well less than 200,000. So what you're essentially saying is every man, woman, and child has been sterilized, that is an Ethiopian Jew in Israel, has been sterilized, and many of them twice. And he said, well, what if there's tens of thousands? I said, what is the number? Give me even an approximate number. And he said, what if there's even one? Isn't that something we should decry? I said, certainly we can decry it. But one is very different than 200,000. And it's irresponsible for you to use this language. This is some of the problems that I see in this whole question of what's legitimate criticism of Israel and what's not. As to international organizations, Michael, you mentioned, we all think of the United Nations. Certainly the Zionism is racism resolution of 1975, which luckily was repealed in 1991. We think of the Human Rights Council, which of all the countries in the world, the only permanent agenda item for the Human Rights Council is Israeli human rights abuses, not Syria, not China with its with its persecution of Uyghur. It's only Israel. And if you look at resolutions that come up every year, Israel by far has more, and in many cases has more than all the rest of the world combined. So there has been a long history. We could go on and on about unfairness in the UN system. I am an optimist by nature, and I will say UN officials, including Secretary General Gutierrez, and so, including the special rapporteur that has been appointed by the UN, have really been addressing these issues of anti-Semitism, and including the anti-Semitism which essentially uses Israel as a replacement word for Jew. And they have been talking about it. So I do see some potential things getting better, but in this world that we live in, we talk about Ukraine and other things, God knows what we're really going to face in the future. By
the way, there are 13,000 Ethiopian Jews living in Israel.
13,000?
So 13,000. So that means that each one would have been sterilized at least 7 to 18 times.
Okay, my math in my head isn't that good, but yes,
So,
that is certainly an example.
If 200,000 was sterilized, then Israel does a lousy job of sterilization as well.
They're making a lot of false positives. Okay, and Michael, your third question was,
now what are the Abraham Accords going to do to that? Are they going to change that substantially?
well, you know, the fascinating part about this is, as in much of the Arab world, this type of demonization of Israel is diminished. From the little I see of textbooks, etc., many of these countries like UAE are actually going through their textbooks and trying to change kind of the educational material, as well as the kind of macro relationship between Israel and an Arab state. but we have a long way to go. But there's no question that this is diminishing in much of the Arab world. Of course, one of the other things we'll talk about, we talk about this type of anti-Semitism throughout the last 2 years in much of the Arab world, particularly you have this notion or this meme of not COVID-19, but it's called COVID-48, meaning that the actual introduction of Israel to the community of nations in 1948 was like a cancer or a disease. And like we have to eradicate COVID-19, we need to eradicate COVID-48. Having said that, there is a diminishing with the Abraham Accords. I don't claim to be an expert on how successful this will be, but certainly in the last 2 years or so, we've seen tremendous advancement on this. But the irony is at the same time this is happening, in much of the West, some political figures, but on the far left, Jeremy Corbyn is a great example, have taken this form of anti-Semitism, whether they realize it or not, whatever their intentions are. I like former Prime Minister Blair says about, when asked if Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite, he says, he's an anti-Semite, he just doesn't know it yet. And I think that may be appropriate in dealing with intentions, which intentions are not necessarily necessary for having anti-Semitism. But so at the same time that this is diminishing in the Arab world, you have this growth in academia. Now, it is not pervasive at all colleges, all universities. Nonetheless, it is frightening, this demonization, this kind of double standard, this delegitimizing of Israel, and the use of terminology, which is so abhorrent and so false that it becomes almost a classic blood libel against not just Israel, but the Jewish people. So, it's classical anti-Semitism. You knock one form down and another one pops back up.
Ira, you did not participate last week in our session, but one of the analogies I use is anti-Semitism, or to reach out to Alan's thing, hatred of Jews is a whack-a-mole.
Yes.
You knock one form down and something else crops up in a very basic way.
Michael, let me just say one other thing about that, because I say it almost every time I speak about anti-Semitism. I get to the end of the presentation and I know people are feeling down, and that the message seems to be so negative about the future. There is something we need to understand. We are not, you and I and others who are fighting this, and are not in the business of eliminating anti-Semitism. We are not going to eliminate anti-Semitism. Not in our lifetimes, not in our great-great-great-great-grandchildren's lifetimes. Been around for at least 2,000 years. It is likely to be here for many centuries to come. Nonetheless, we don't have to eliminate it. I think the analogy, the great analogy, is a faucet. You can't turn the faucet totally off, but we can certainly turn it down. It was turned down after World War II. We can turn it down in society after society. And by the way, it's a multi-pronged job, because it is not just one place. It is in multiple countries, literally scores of countries, and in each country, it manifests itself in a different way. But we can knock it down, we can eliminate it. And that's not a pessimistic, it is just a realistic understanding of anti-Semitism.
Well, let me add a couple of things. I had a conversation this week with a wonderful scholar of Zionism who was talking about the issue between Israel and Iran. And I said two things that I'd like you to look at. I said, from a historical point of view, what is remarkable in Jewish history, if you begin in biblical times, the only time the Jews were ever independent was when Babylon and Egypt were in a non-expansionist mode. Israel is located at the intersection historically of Babylon and Egypt. It is a major Middle East trade route. And what's remarkable now is that the Israelis have been independent virtually longer than the heralded kingdom of David and Solomon, and all of the all of the accomplishments of the Maccabean revolt, which we celebrate in Hanukkah. And the other part of it is, even though the heirs of the Babylonians, meaning the Iranians, pose a risk to Israel, which people have described as an existential risk, we have a brand new circumstances, which is Israel poses an existential risk to Iran if Iran truly acts on its existential attack on Israel. And that is unprecedented in the 3,000 years, 3,100 years that Jews have lived in the neighborhood that we call contemporary Israel. So let's also understand that if we're not going to eliminate anti-Semitism, we're in a unique moment in Jewish history of empowerment that, and some people resent Jews for their power at this point, and they exaggerate it. And my friend David Beale has a great line: Jews have never been as powerful as our enemies have suspected us of being. And there might be, it might be wonderful to be as powerful as our enemies suspected us as being, but we do have a considerable amount of power now that we never had before. And the other part of it is that Israel also is now even seen dramatically as a haven and functioning as a haven in a very particular way. Let's turn to my third question, Ira. What do you think of the mediation between of the Prime Minister of Israel between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, Michael, I will say, and you're not supposed to do this as a speaker, say this is not my wheelhouse. So I'll give you but I will of course give you my opinion. Israel is.
I was going to say, since when does that mean you can't?
Well, yes, for me, I will talk about things I don't know about, but at least I'll try to be a little honest about it. I see Israel in a very, both in this situation of being a serious regional power in the region, and that it's the first time in history that essentially populations are not necessarily the most important thing in describing the power of a country, and Israel is the blue perfect example of that. And but Israel's in a situation where,
by the way, I'm a deep believer in that, because power in the 21st century, in part, is in the ability to get your hands around and the management of information. Yep. And in all of the tools of globalization. And in that, Israel has become a very significant power. Ironically, with limitations. If we were talking about the economics of Israel, we would say Israel can be the incubator of billion-dollar companies, but can't be the incubator of $100 billion companies.
Yeah.
And it's done a very good job, but you can't, as it were, and this is where BDS plays a peculiar function, you can't eliminate Israel even with were BDS fully successful, because it's an integrated part of the global highways of information. That should give the Jews a good deal of solace and pride.
I think all those things are true, and Israel is playing a very difficult realpolitik game. On the one hand, it seems to be very clear, and I think the Israelis understand this, that they're much better off in a world that has a dominant superpower that's the United States, other than others as either a multipolar world or others being dominant. Being in a world where democracies are the most powerful agents is in long-term interest. And on the other hand, sitting on its doorstep next to the Golan, is an incredibly important Russian military presence, and essentially can control to a large degree what Assad does in Damascus and what the Iranians can do. And the Iranians certainly clearly want to set up some kind of military bases, et cetera, on Israel's borders. So the Russians are quite important to that. So I think it's almost absolutely essential for the Israelis, on the one hand, to be supportive, and I think I would want them to be, of Ukraine, but also keep their hand in reaching out and keeping some kind of relationship with Putin, because there are very few people now in the world that are in that situation. And again, I am not the expert on this, but I hope there are people talking to Putin in the coming months, because he can be a very dangerous man in the end.
And Israel also doesn't have a tremendous amount of freedom of action to operate fully independently of the United States, except in its most vital interests. Let's turn. We've been asked a question. I said that anti-Semitism is 2,000 years old. Romans were pragmatic. Why were they anti-Jewish? Let me give a historian's answer to that. The Romans, there were three aspects of the Roman-Jewish relationship that led to problems. Number one is the Jews would not accept the full cultural dominance of Rome. Rome wanted to have a very light hand in administering the territories, but it wanted a very significant cultural dominance and values dominance. And monotheism didn't do well by admitting other gods into it. Secondly is that Jews attacked Rome to achieve a measure of independence. And you can attack a superpower as long as the superpower doesn't begin to use their power against you. And if you look at the history, they began by having victories. They then became overconfident. And the moment Rome paid attention to what the Jews were doing was the moment at which they dedicated the necessary troops in order to control and conquer. And remember we are the heirs not of Masada and not of Barkhoffrum, but we are the heirs of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, who essentially said, I'm going to create a portable religion that was not land-centered and temple-centered, but could be wherever Jews can exist as a spiritual community. The most important element of that in Rome is we were not willing to adopt their gods to adhere to their cultural dominance. And we fought that. And if we achieved a measure of independence, that was fine. When that became a violent measure of independence, Rome paid attention, and that created a dramatic imbalance. They were pragmatic, and there were points at which we were dogmatic and didn't work on a modus vivendi, but we are the descendants of the people who appealed to their pragmatism.
Well, and Michael, one of the books I enjoy most is the Harkabi book called the Barkhoffrum Syndrome, which he did argue that in the course of 50 years, the Jews revolted 3 major revolts against the Romans. And the Jewish community had the best intelligence network in the empire. There were Jews in Iberia and Spain. There were Jews throughout Europe. There were Jews all throughout North Africa, in the edges of the empire near the Parthian Empire. And the only way to defeat a superpower was if the superpower had multiple revolts on its hands. And the Jews knew better than anybody else if that was happening or not. And in certainly, particularly the most prominent example, first obviously is the 70 revolt, then the revolt in Alexandria in North Africa in about 118, and then the 130 revolt by Barkhoffrum. And, by that time, Rome had enough of our stiff-neckedness. And again, this is not to defend Rome, etc., but This in some ways was almost national suicide. And the fact that Galilee did not revolt, the fact that we had the rabbinic tradition already well on its way to developing this system, that's what saved the Jewish people.
I'll give two comments on that. My mother taught me values. She said, you got to be careful, only pick on people your own size. She didn't have to warn me that I shouldn't pick on somebody much bigger and much stronger than me, because I understood I couldn't win that battle. Instead, she warned me essentially it's not right to pick on somebody weaker and smaller and the like. We picked on a very powerful enemy, and the moment we exacerbated that enemy's anger was the moment that we faced defeat. 3 times in half a century, in 60 years actually. And the third time, Rome destroyed the temple the first time, but still had Jewish sovereignty in its own particular way. By the Barkhoffrum Rebellion, we were sent into exile. Now, the genius of Judaism and the reason we survived is from 586 onward. Even after defeat, we did not disappear. And we are the only ancient people who have not disappeared after defeat. That's why we had diaspora. And a part of that is what Harkavi argued for, is a certain political realism, which is to understand both the limits of power and the use of power in a very particular way. And that it's ironic. I taught that book last week to my students,
Right.
teaching them essentially how some of the issues of history are not only about the past, but they're also about the present and the future, and how you remember the past shapes the way in which you grapple with the future. And there was an interesting column last week by Danny Gordis, who's a great defender of Israel, former colleague of mine at American Jewish University. And they were talking about the Ukrainians who were leaving. And he was saying, we're not going to leave. And the question became, we are ironically the descendants of those who found a way in the aftermath, who left and reconstituted themselves. That's not to say that we don't revere those who stayed and fought, but it's to say that we have to understand where we come from and who we come from and how we came from, and why that became a particular key to survival.
And I think, Michael, to your points, it's incumbent upon us in the Jewish community to be wise about the lessons of history. We don't have the luxury of ignoring it. Supposedly, Mark Twain once said, history never repeats itself, but it often rhymes. We need to figure out, as we combat anti-Semitism, as we face the 21st century, as Israel faces multiple problems, we have to be realistic and we have to do a good job, best we can, even though we don't have the gift of prophecy anymore, of figuring out what history can teach us. And then let me just say one other thing that reflects on this picking on someone much bigger than you. One of my best friends from school is a son of a senior Israeli diplomat. And I always thought he did this very well in describing how Israel should act. And it said, in terms of picking fights with friends like the United States, that you should never pull on Superman's cape. That, I guess, is from a song, but don't pull on Superman's cape. And sometimes Israel has pulled on the cape, and it may not be the best way to act in the world.
Let's talk for a moment about your former position. What should the United States be doing to combat anti-Semitism formally as a government? And what was your role in that? And what type of support does that role require in order to really be effective?
Well, first off, I don't want to be so arrogant to say I have all the answers, and I certainly don't. And the other thing that
At least we should have all the questions.
yes, I didn't even have all the questions when I started. It took me a few months to find the men's room at the State Department, let alone understand some of the issues. And I think every special envoy, especially one who's now at the ambassadorial level, needs to have a little time to digest not just the situation in the world, which Deborah Lipstadt is monumentally qualified to do of anyone that I know, but also understand where the United States has the strongest role. And each of us, there's been now four special envoys, have a little different take. My take, which I still think is important, is to prioritize. There are never enough resources, even with the resources of a superpower, to do everything you want to do. And when I say prioritize, each form of anti-Semitism is different in a different time, in a different place. So anti-Semitism in a different country, in one country, could actually change over 2 or 3 years. So you have to focus on a time and place. And every year we reprioritize what countries we felt were Jewish communities were most in danger. Danger could mean literally elimination, usually by emigration, but sometimes by also some deaths. It could mean assimilation. It could mean people leaving because things like circumcision were outlawed. All those things are important to prioritize, but where the United States has most ability as a country to impact is, I think of a continuum of countries. On the one hand, you have countries like France and the UK and Germany who are very good friends of the United States and are democratic allies, and most importantly, have had leadership, thankfully, over the last decade or so, that understands that anti-Semitism in their own country is not just about doing something for their Jews, it's about protecting their own democracy. And so we may have differences.
Hold it for one second. Let's underscore that. You've said something very important. I just read a wonderful biography of Angela Merkel. And Angela Merkel was both pro-Israel and against anti-Semitism, not so much out of a love of Jews, but much more because she wanted a Germany that was accepting and welcoming of its Jewish community, accepting and welcoming of its responsibility to the past, and therefore supportive of Israel, even when it had policy differences. She did it for the best of reasons, which is her self-interest in what Germany wanted to achieve. And that's, by the way, also what we saw when the leaders of Europe, in the aftermath of the hyper-kasher and the Charlie Hebdo thing, marched down opposing anti-Semitism, not so much out of a passionate love for Jews, but we don't want a society in which such hatred comes to be. And by the way, we hear that in the United States now. You've had these people on the Republican Party who appeared at anti-Semitic white supremacist rallies, and Republicans have said, Mitch McConnell said, we have no place for anti-Semitism and white supremacy in the Republican Party, because he doesn't want that in the Republican Party, doesn't want that in America. In the same way that you just had a governor respond after the governor of Kentucky, responding after an idiotic anti-Semitic statement made by two of his members of the legislature, saying there's no place for anti-Semitism in our country. That's a vision in our state. That's a vision of how you want to create society that, and we can say sometimes anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem, it's the problem of the non-Jews.
Yeah.
That's a very important point to stress.
The most important thing I heard in 4 years was from a leader of one of the Jewish organizations, actually the volunteer security organization in France, in the direct aftermath of the riots after the Gaza war in 2014, July and August. in which we were asking him what he thought was the future of French Jewry. And he went through lots of things about immigration and assimilation, et cetera. And he went through this whole litany, including what the government was doing was so good. And he ended it by saying, but ultimately, this is not about us. It's not about the Jewish community. It's about the very values of the French Republic. And we've been, I think, fortunate in the larger Western European powers in recent decades. And it's not a given, because it wouldn't have been the same if Corbyn had become Prime Minister of Great Britain. A realization that this is not just a favor to Jews, this is a favor to your own societies and your ability to keep a strong democracy. Going back to this continuum, and you asked about where we can be most effective. We can work with Germany or France to help them with their anti-Semitic problems. We often don't know how to deal with their problems. We don't have the size of an Arab minority that, by and large, our Muslim population is quite educated and relatively high income. It's a very different population and much smaller than in places like France or Germany or even the UK. But we can try to help, but we can't fix their problems. And we can only work with them. On the other end of the spectrum are the countries like Iran or Venezuela, where we have almost no relationship. And no matter what we say, it's not going to be very material, especially since there are so many huge issues, including a nuclear Iran, et cetera, that will dominate any discussions with those countries. It's the countries in the middle who are having anti-Semitic problems, and particularly where the government plays a role in anti-Semitism, because those countries need the United States support. And I'm talking in particular here in today's world, it could change tomorrow, in countries like Hungary and Poland, where governments have used anti-Semitism. I would not call them anti-Semitic governments like you saw in the run-up to World War II, but they use anti-Semitism subtly sometimes, not so subtly in other times, for their own political purposes. These are countries that need our support, and they depend on us. And unfortunately, both are countries that are going in an authoritarian way. We have the ability to put pressure on them. We can't unilaterally change them, but we can make them pay serious costs for playing the game of anti-Semitism. I happen to think,
and if we go back to the late 80s and early 90s, one of the things when you write a history of that period of time, one of the things that those countries had to do in order to find a home in the West and move toward the West. And remember, Poland and Hungary, for example, had built their future in alliance with the Soviet Union. They were part of the Warsaw Pact and under Soviet domination. And when they wanted Western domination, they were told in no uncertain terms, you have to come to terms with the Jews and come to terms with the Holocaust. And that they did during the 90s and the 2000s. And then there's been a dramatic shift over the last 8 or 10 years, which is quite significant.
Yes, and that scares the heck out of me. Again, it's not this type of new anti-Semitism that's related to Israel by and large, but it is the older forms. And anti-Semitism can be a relatively popular issue in some of these countries. And we can make them pay a significant price for doing that. And it's important not just to stop growing anti-Semitism in those countries, but it also sends a message to other countries who are thinking, can we start distorting the history of the Holocaust, which Hungary has done, which Poland is doing in a major way now. And if they can get away with it, then we will have countries, I'm afraid, that are their neighbors who also feel they can get away with it. And that distortion of the Holocaust, a blindness to their own role, and none of us, including the United States, have clean hands when it comes to the Holocaust. But certainly these countries don't as well. Poland was, I have sympathy for Poland because Poland was so brutally dealt with by the Nazis, and the Catholic population suffered. But still, as many as I guess the most righteous nations come from Poland, but it's also because Poland had half of the the killings from the Holocaust. And there were many, 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 many Poles who collaborated, even if though there wasn't any type of government in Poland that was a Polish government. So it is not just in those countries, it is also saying a lesson that there's a geopolitical price to pay for distorting your history. We don't want to, 1984 is not where we want to go to.
Let me respond to one question that we were asked. How does one respond to a Jewish historian of the Judaic Studies Department, California University, who spoke of Jews and race a year ago, who asserts that there's no anti-Semitism in the United States? The answer to that is, I don't know how you argue with ignorance and stupidity. Would that there were no anti-Semitism in the United States. I think that the dialogue we're having and the discussion we're having over this period of time is not that there's no anti-Semitism, it's how concerned should we be, how we'd understand it. But I don't think anybody in their right mind can at this point indicate that there's no anti-Semitism in the United States. We had a period of time in which people sort of felt that anti-Semitism was an issue of the past and not the present. I'm finding throughout the Jewish community, and even among most secular, least identified Jews that I know, all of a sudden there's a dramatic concern with anti-Semitism. Witness the fact that the Holocaust Memorial in Miami Beach felt the obligation to serve the community of the United States and Greater Florida in particular by discussing anti-Semitism for 5 weeks in a row. So a professor who says that doesn't quite understand what they're talking about. And we should have, all we should say is, there's a Yiddish word, alavai. May we live in a world in which there's no anti-Semitism in the United States. I think the one thing everybody on this conversation can agree with is that's not our world.
Yeah.
And we have to deal, Jews should be realistic about the world in which we live and not confuse reality with aspiration.
You know, I like that, Michael, a lot, because I believe that we as a Jewish community, and certainly Jewish communal leadership, does not have the luxury of emotion, does not have the luxury of not being very hard-headed in our analysis. And I'm going to say something that maybe is not the most popular thing. First off, let me say that I worry about anti-Semitism in the United States so much more today than I did 5 years ago when I left the State Department. By certain standards, like attitudinal anti-Semitism remains low in this country. But you have to just look at anti-Semitic incidents, not just the ADL data. I'm looking every day in the in the English language press around the world. The amount of anti-Semitic incidents, it has been, the taboos against speaking and doing anti-Semitic things have broken down. Having said all that, and I worry deeply that this is a serious problem for the United States, I still worry less about the American Jewish community than I worry about any other diaspora community. We still have tremendous resources. We have tremendous allies, which may be the most important thing. We can get them in civil society to act with us. We have so many resources that other Jewish communities around the world do not have. And as I said, at least till now, attitudinal anti-Semitism has not gone up if you look at the polling. But if you have a breakdown in taboos, you are, again, very unrealistic if you don't think that's going to change over time. So we've got to address those problems.
Ira, first of all, you've given us a wonderful segue to our next program. Of course, the next program is with a man you well know, Mark Weitzman. And the program is on anti-Semitism as manifest in the internet and social networks. which is one of the major means today. I call it a megaphone and for anti-Semitism, and also the social support network. And that's where we're going to go next. And I think you and I are in absolutely fundamental agreement that America is not in as bad a shape as we think it is, but that's not, or as we feel it to be. I think we have a difference between thinking about it and feeling about it as we feel it to be. But that does not mean that there's not an area of serious concern. Witness this program, witness the discussion, and witness, unfortunately, the fact that everybody has to grapple with it. Thank you very much, Ira, and thank you very much for participating in this program. Am I turning it back to Sydney or to Sharon or to Nikki?
Nikki.
Hi, thank you so much. That was a really fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate you two participating in this. So if there are no further questions, I'm going to end the event. So thank you again, and I hope we see all of you at the next event at the end of March. Have a good night, everyone.